going to do a little bit of a part one and part two. We're going to really talk about the exhibition that took place at the V&A last summer, Heatherwick Studio, Designing the Extraordinary. We're going to talk about how we collaborated as sort of designer of the exhibition and a designer of the studio, being Neil, and me as curator of the exhibition. Because of course Neil is a designer at the studio and in fact worked most recently on the London bus, which many of you will have seen stopping by on the 24 route just on Hampstead Road. But Neil was also appointed as the designer of the exhibition. We're going to talk a little bit about how that was actually quite a new model for us to work curatorially, to actually work with a designer who was the sort of subject of the show, but also working to form the physical experience of the space. But I think Neil's going to start by talking a little bit about the sort of digital design processes in the studio and how you approach these challenges that we've been discussing.
Yeah, I'll give a little bit of background about the studio's work and how we design digitally. I think Cliff put very well all of the stages about our digital work now is very rarely singular data, but just a collection of references and links that actually form the things that people visualize. And for us, how we involve kind of craft processes and physical processes within that the digital processes, we feel that's very important. And as Abraham said, as how we work together on the exhibition and using our digital archive to actually inform the exhibition design. A little bit of background about the studio's work. This is if you don't know us very well, this is an installation we did for Harvey Nichols a number of years ago. We've done a bridge in Paddington in London that curled up into a ball. This is a hospital building outside Guy's Hospital in South London. This is an artist's studio in West Wales. This is a pavilion we designed for the World Expo in 2010. This is the London bus, which is featured on that road outside in the cheesy postcard shot on our inaugural journey in London. And we most recently designed the cauldron for the 2012 Olympic Games. And just a little bit about how we design digitally and how we kind of maintain the record of that, and also then how we use some of those aspects involved in the exhibition. This was part of the process that we used to design a sculpture in London, actually just down the road at the Wellcome Trust building, called Blygesen, which was taken from a form about yay big, a bit of molten metal that was formed into this shape, and we took that form and scanned it in and reinterpreted it, because we wanted to take that form and blow it up to be roughly 30 meters tall, and how we kind of did that. And we took the scanned information and broke it down into a series of data, a series of contours, which were then reinterpreted in a kind of very dense, I don't know how well you can see that, packing grid of circles to create this very, very complicated form. 300 or so thousand beads, and into this very, very large sculpture comprised of, I think, 27,000 wires. And interestingly, the kind of archived portion of this data and then the output of this data is actually just a series of numbers. It's a spreadsheet, effectively, of very, very complex 3D data that was then used on these long runs of tables just of where you would place a bead and then crimp it onto a wire. So actually the only real output that we have of this is just a series of lists with A, B's and C's on them, and which is actually what we then had at our exhibition. We had one of these lengths of tables with the lists on them, and that was the only real output for a very, very large three-dimensional sculpture. Similarly, when we work on various projects and when we work digitally, it's often alongside very three-dimensional and physical processes, because we find designing digitally very difficult to do sometimes. When we worked on the UK pavilion, the landscape that the pavilion sat on, we wanted to feel like this unwrapped piece of paper. And it's very difficult to design crumpled paper. It's very difficult to try and draw it convincingly. If you ever try and say, oh, imagine it's like clay being pushed and twisted, or wood being... It's very difficult to draw these things in the computer. You actually have to twist wood, or you have to play with clay and then use digital means in order to replicate that in the computer. So similarly on this project, we crumpled a lot of paper. I mean, God knows how many paper tests until we found the right one that was, okay, that's the kind of thing that we wanted to. And then use 3D scanning technology to interpret that in the 3D model and then modify and optimize it for construction to become the landscape that this object then sat on. And for me, working on the bus for 2 years was a really amazing experience, because that whole process of linking files and creating 2D data, drawing files that you then review, or issue didn't exist on this project. This project was primarily modeled in 3D, and then even there wasn't any output to discuss with the various consultants and the manufacturers 2D data. It was done primarily on the phone, and both on our end with a 3D model and zooming around it, and on their end as well, and just discussing how the design would change. So there's not even that much of an iterative record of how the design changed. There's a model that's just constantly growing and changing to the point where you export these data and these references of objects to become CNC routed parts. This is for the rear staircase, which are then used as layup tools for fiberglass and 3D processes. So that record of how that design changed is very difficult to keep hold of. But even so, when you're primarily working the 3D, we don't trust it very much. And even though it might comply to the regulations and the widths and things that you might need, and you can trust that data, it's very difficult to understand how that feels. And that was very, very important to us. So we still had to do various mock-ups and tests in the studio just to know ourselves of if we felt the ceiling height was right or the window height was right. And that process was still very, very important to us, despite these very, very sophisticated tools that we had at our disposal. And then I guess similarly, things that you might think are very, very, very handmade. This is, sorry, you can't see it very well, but a plan of the cauldron for the Olympic Games, where they have 204 very individual petals that were hand-beaten, hand-formed, amazingly sculptural artifacts, were in fact a product of a number of very basic scripts. Even the 3D data that was used to generate these forms is not 3D data that you might typically know of 3D models and things, but just a series of algorithms and scripts that formed this densely packed set of objects that was then exported out again as the 3D data, used as molds, and created as these panelized beautiful objects. So again, that record of how you kind of manage that, where it simply is just a script on the computer of computer code used to create very, very beautiful things, I think is going to be an interesting point. Alice, who's sitting here, is our archivist at the studio, so I think she's got this wonderful task of trying to, as these tools become more and more advanced, and as our processes, which used to be very much craft-based and in the workshop, become more three-dimensional and more based in these complex computerized methods, how we maintain that record is going to be very important to us. And I think it was very important then how we use that information on designing the show together, because it was very important for Abraham, I mean, I don't know if you want to say, to get the feeling of the studio within our show.
Yeah, because I think that's a very good point that Neil makes, and I think Cliff mentioned as well, is this idea that a lot of projects through the studio's lifetime have actually spanned a pre-digital design process age, and now you see certain projects which have, even within one project, have sort of been moulded through a kind of digital design process, having started initially in a very sort of craft-oriented practice. And for me as a curator in the exhibition, I mean, the first thing to say, and perhaps this is a good image to illustrate this, I mean, I don't know how many of you have actually been to the Heatherwick Studio, to that space. I mean, okay, well, the first time I went, it was just an extraordinary experience to see so much of the archive on open display like this, and you can tell by looking at these little shelves to the left that it's not just presentation models. It's everything ranging from sort of scale maquettes for the Vents project in Paternoster Square to material samples. I mean, Cliff mentioned the sort of very physical reality of these samples which are stored, and many of these samples at the studio are actually stored on sort of conspicuous display in the studio, there are sort of furniture prototypes, and so I really wanted the exhibition to feel like an archive on open display. A really important sort of imperative for the exhibition was to make it feel like an exhibition about process, which is actually something we do very rarely in the V&A in exhibition terms. And my role at the V&A, well, at least for the next 2 weeks before I leave, is curator of design drawings. So this idea of design process is something I'm very passionate about, and in a way this was a dream project because, well, firstly Thomas, who you can see there in the middle of a design meeting, was very open. I mean, it took a bit of persuasion, I think, at the beginning, but I think once he got on board, he was happy to actually make the whole archive available. So in a way, it's a dream for a curator to be able to have unparalleled access to the archive. And so I was really interested in making the exhibition be very rich and very full, and you'll see from the images later on how densely packed the exhibition was, because I wanted to somehow convey the sense of many of these objects starting from a very craft-based process. And the workshop, which I don't know if you have an image of the workshop, but
no,
you may have glimpsed it in some of the earlier images, it's kind of through there. But the workshop is an extraordinary space in the studio, and it's sort of physically and conceptually at the heart of that space in King's Cross, just in next to the Travelodge by the station. Many of the concepts kind of originate there, and it doesn't simply exist as a space for the beginning of the project and then they're not involved. I get a sense there's very much a kind of feedback mechanism, and designers will often go to the workshop to get sort of something mocked up in 3D or rapid prototyped. And so I wanted the exhibition to really feel like there was a richness of that type of material to show things spanning both a digital form and a very physical form. And so the other thing to say is that at the V&A we very rarely work on contemporary exhibitions about a solo living designer, apart from the world of fashion. So actually this was a rare opportunity for us to work very closely with the studio, whom we very quickly appointed as the designers. It just felt like the logical decision to ask Neil and the studio to design the show, as well as being a subject, which of course has its challenges. Do you want to say a bit about that?
Thomas often say that you'd prefer it if he was dead. Also, it was weird from my point of view, being a member of the studio for a long period of time, and also Thomas referring to me as the kind of living archive in the studio, because I've worked on so many of the studio's concepts. When we're having design reviews, we'll often bring up projects that we've worked on in the past, and I go, oh yeah, we did that, and we tried that process, and so he'll often, when he's having a review, go, Neil, did we try that yeah, we tried it in 2006, it was this concept, it never worked. He's like, okay. And but so being the studio's, the exhibition designer, and how best to represent our work, and also taking away my personal connection to those projects and how we develop them. And so I have an opinion on what objects I think, or what best represents those projects. And obviously Thomas has a very strong opinion on what best represents those projects. And so for you to kind of sit with him and argue over how we get represented was a fun process to be part of. Because
it was actually really useful to be able to work with Neil and with Thomas when arranging the objects, and this was something we'll come on to, but in terms of, because as a curator you kind of start with the general narrative of the exhibition, you come up with an object list, and then you think about the so-called hang, but here there was a real opportunity to think about the hang in a spatial, three-dimensional way, and to work with Neil and others in the studio who've actually worked on these projects to really understand what is the logical kind of order of these objects which represent certain moments in the design process. And so so we gave a kind of what I hope was quite a clear design brief about the exhibition having a non-linear narrative, and not to be chronological. And so do you want to talk about how you responded to that design brief? For
the brief was wonderful, because it was very clear about the type of exhibition that Abraham wanted to portray, and we knew, given the constraints of the site, that we had very strong limitations, that we couldn't really, we had the Porta Gallery where you couldn't fix into the floor, you had an amazing height, but we had a lot of objects, and we really wanted to kind of fill that height, and a simple kind of table layout wouldn't have been appropriate. We couldn't really hang things in the space, and so this kind of notion that Abraham wanted to create of clustering of objects, and really feel like it was this container full of things that had almost been cracked open, and it was this these clusters of information together, and that each project could kind of leak into each other, and also treat the image components and the digital components with equal weighting with the physical objects. And so each one of these objects had their own importance that would create a kind of a fully rounded impression of the projects. And just a little bit how we developed the notion of the space. We wanted to create a kind of timeline that had moments of drama and moments of calmness, but I think in the end it was probably full-on drama because of the amount of content that we had. And so very, very crudely, how we would start to create that space and create this kind of space with a series of alveoli, almost increasing the surface area in areas where you could discover new things and really kind of explore through the space. And using digital tools to create the kind of notion of this landscape with these moments of drama, and reinterpret that as the actual plinths that we would have on display as our kind of conceptual starting point. But then go very much back into working with Abraham. We had 30 meters of magnet wall down in our archive space, and we would place this orange line which indicated your eye height, and each one of these images was a printout of an object that we would have in our exhibition. and pretty simply to go through and go, okay, what objects should we have along that eye line, and then what should be above and what should be below, and actually unconsciously develop this language of process objects generally being below and finished images and artifacts being above, and the key objects being along that eye line. So as you worked progressively from low to high, you would see the process of project from conception to completion.
And if I can say something quickly about the sort of image resources. Cliff mentioned, I think you use OpenAsset here, which is what the studio uses as well. So this image database was actually invaluable for me as a curator, because in the past the exhibitions I've done have tended to be on sort of deceased subjects. So to actually work with a living archive where there is this huge amount of sort of live visual material covering everything from images of design meetings and images of models and images from presentations and reports, using that OpenAsset database and having been given a password to access it myself and not having to always go to someone at the studio to ask for certain images. It was fantastic. And so these images are just, I think most of these images are actually printouts. They're about kind of A5 size printouts from OpenAsset, and that kind of helped form the object selection. But just to be able to have that access from the beginning was fantastic. It was never kind of really restricted.
And then similarly, we would place on large sheets of paper where we thought particular projects should go, or where Abraham thought particular projects should go, knowing the connections that he wanted to make with us. And it was really these two very low-tech methods that helped us start to produce the layout and physical arrangement of objects. And as you can see, and a vast amount of content that we had to display in this space. The blue items indicating showcased items under hoods, and the grey ones being objects on open display. And we worked together for several months to really refine this arrangement, both in plan and in three-dimensional height. And we knew, because we had 3 times more content than they've ever placed in this gallery, that to be on site, Abraham would not have the luxury of being able to kind of place objects as he saw on site and respond to the space, but we had to do that all pre-planned, because on site we had a very limited time to get that content in, and it had to be done very, very meticulously. So we actually were able to use a lot of our digital archive, and we produced these kind of 3-dimensional spreadsheets of the objects that we had on display. And I guess being the owners of this content was a great resource for us to have, so because we already had all these projects built, and we had the 3D models and the information that was used to create those models, so we're able to produce our kind of 3D object list.
And because normally, I mean, that was fantastic, because if I can just go back to that.
Yeah, of course.
Because usually as curators you'll use a fairly lo-fi approach and just have a couple of JPEGs embedded into an Excel spreadsheet. But to actually be able to use these 3D CAD models, and these are all to scale. I mean, they're all kind of relationally to scale, aren't they, Neil?
Yeah.
So you could, at a glance, you could look at a kind of flattened landscape of the exhibition. So normally with a JPEG, you kind of have to work out how big a certain object is based on guessing from the image. But here we could, at a glance, work out where these clusters would be more dense, less dense. And I mean, Neil mentioned having the kind of 3D. It's kind of inventory, but there are many cases where we would have people actually measuring samples or models which hadn't been, because they were simply fragments as a result of an early part of the design process. These things weren't created in 3D, they weren't CAD models, so we would have people measuring them down in the basement in the archive, and then you or someone would actually create a 3D model of a fragment or a piece of plaster or a piece of, piece of clay, and that was really used to have everything mapped 3-dimensionally. So then we could.
As I said, we had to front load the process quite a lot, because we knew we had such limited time on site. So anything that we could do pre-planning, as I said, Abraham and I would sit together and pull and push these plinths up and down until we felt it had the right arrangement and the right associations. And we would sit with this model for hours and making sure that was carefully planned out, to the extent that the visualizations we were able to produce for the exhibition were very, very realistic of the type of space that we wanted to create. And I was hoping that this would pay off, and that we would produce the kind of space that we wanted. And I was very surprised in the end of everyone's relief on site that it was as we'd kind of planned.
Often when you, in the past when I've worked with an exhibition designer, the renderings will be pretty accurate, but they're often just placeholders. You would never go to the level of detail of giving them the exact object list, the exact hang, and they would never come back with a sort of detailed design stage. They would never present a render which actually had every single object to scale with the correct lighting, modelling. So that last image is kind of unique, certainly in my experience, to be able to pre-visualize to that level of detail. And even the sort of the size of the labels, they're all very different, but they're all exactly as we had sort of pre-planned. So that was, again, all because we had the original raw data to play with, and then from that we could do whatever we wanted.
Yeah, the digital archive was such a great resource, and each one of these objects was referenced from those other project drives. And as you see, we're on site, so many objects, the install was so carefully kind of planned out, even to the point where individual objects and their mounting requirements were 3D modelled and then given as a series of plans, both to the contractor to build the plinth, but also for the people handling the objects, so that we had planned that out. We're just in tables in the studio, the arrangement we wanted, that we would 3D model that and have these as these series of drawings, so the art handlers themselves knew how to place this. So rather than, there was a couple of objects that Abraham would carefully, artistically arrange. We try to just minimise that as much as possible, given,
the plan had always been to tour this exhibition internationally, and there'll be a kind of a different version that will happen now in North America. But the hope was that with all this investment up front, we would not only would it help our technicians on site here at the V&A, but to be able to give people exact specifications for those plinths, those hoods, would have saved so much effort in the future for when we do estimates for crating costs and the insurance estimates and everything, because that's just so rare to have that much detail this far in advance.
Yeah, and it's definitely helped us out for future exhibitions, and allowed us to minimise the design process on those shows. And as I said, the visualizations that we were able to produce were very, very accurate and gave everyone a confidence that when it actually came onto site, it was a pretty reflective. These are the finished site photos, and I think what was wonderful for me were those. When we were talking early on about the connections that you might make between various objects and various projects, I never really believed how clear or transparent cases might be. I know that sounds bizarre, but you really were able to look through and see towards other projects and then make connections that we hadn't felt that were possible.
And without being able to sit next to Neil in front of his workstation and to play around with that 3D map, we would never have been able to kind of, even though we weren't sure how it would end up, we kind of could sort of pre-visualise that if you stood here, you'd better look through a Perspex hood and see the very large backside of the bus, for example, or you'd be able to compare this maquette next to that model, but it was great to be able to see how it was kind of very satisfying to see how close our pre-visualization was to the actual finished effect.
Yeah, and I think that's what we have.
And just sort of to make a general point, I think it was. Perhaps Neil might want to reflect on this as well, but from a...
it's kind of like therapy for us, by the way.
It is, yes. You can reflect upon... it's quite a while ago now, it feels. For the studio, it was kind of an interesting point, because at the same time the studio were doing their first ever book with Thames and Hudson, and so parallel to this exhibition there was this huge drive to kind of go through the archive, which was driven really in a way by me sort of saying to Thomas, look, I need to have access to everything, and eventually he let me. But also it was really helpful to be able to sit back and think about the whole studio's evolution, and to for the first time to measure some of these things that had never been taken out of their boxes in years, things that were still at Thomas's house, things that were still off-site, and we kind of physically brought together the archive for the first time. I remember with crates suddenly arriving from North London where Thomas lives, and it's kind of really...
And I guess for me, certain objects that might have been sitting on your shelf collecting dust for the past few years, once they then go under a Perspex hood, look incredible. They look that's a natural artifact.
I go around like a magpie going, what's this thing above your desk? This looks interesting. What's the
it's just like a little rubbish test, and then amazing to see parts of those processes that you might think are useless, or not necessarily useless, but don't really have their value in this show, alongside the other pieces, and alongside animations and digital content that we use. I think really gave it a richness and a density for sure. It was an amazing experience for us to first ever time that we put ourselves on show. In a book you have much more opportunity to write about yourself, but really here, really what you're saying about yourself and how you're describing yourself and your work was a really interesting exercise. And
so I can remember the first time that I took Thomas down to the basement to look at my kind of rough layout of what I'd chosen from the full archive. He kind of almost had a physical sort of vomiting response to kind of... He'd seen these things which he hadn't seen, he thought he'd never picked from...
Well, he's described it as
prototypes and...
when apparently, your life flashing before your eyes, your kind of working life laid out in front of you. He said it was a kind of bizarre...
He dealt with it very well, I thought. He kind of managed to swallow and then it was fine. But, and of course, Neil mentioned Alice, who has been appointed as the archivist, and there's also an exhibitions person at the studio, so it's in a way I think it's been a kind of a great chance to now sort of set a foundation for how you think about the archive. And maybe that's something we can discuss.
Yeah, definitely. And I think through this process we've really seen the value of this archive and archiving correctly and both physically and digitally. And I think, as I said, the transition. I mean, for us, our made objects are always, we feel like that's where our value is when we have presentations. The models that we produce and the 3D objects we make is where the heart of our process lies. But similarly, there's a lot of background work, much of which Thomas himself does not understand. When he's seeing me kind of on the computer and scripting away, he doesn't really understand how that produces the design work that we're trying to create. But I think there's a real value in a lot of the hours in the studio spent in this work. And never really gets represented.
Something that I certainly took away from it, which may not be so relevant at the Sohn, but the fact that I can sit with Neil and look at how he uses Rhino scripting tools, for example, and how watching him design this space digitally, you can as a curator, it's a really rare chance to understand how these digital design processes work, and I think that's a big challenge. It may have been covered yesterday, I'm sure, in the session, but as curators, we need to really sort of put ourselves in the mindset of designers to understand how, if we're going to archive collections like this, we need to understand how these objects come together and how they evolve. And so to be able to sit with them and design it together was really valuable.
And similarly, having a backseat driver.
yeah, exactly.
No, it was a brilliant exercise to sit kind of together and I guess give each other confidence that what you're doing is hopefully the right approach. And yeah, it was the most successful paid exhibition at the V&A or something like that? Something like that.
Yeah. Contemporary.
Contemporary, yeah. I think it's quite a sub-niche category of most successful contemporary exhibition about a living architect. That's us. Thank you.